So hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to the third episode. So first of all, thank you everyone for being here, to actually coming and being with us, actually being interested in the talks that we are going to have today. Today, as you must have seen, we are going to have two talks. So I would like to first thank the speakers, also thank everyone who came here, thank the sponsors. Our latest sponsor was Whitesmith, and it's actually our host today. So Gonçalo, if you want to talk a little bit, as I asked you. Say a little hi.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? So yeah, just saying hi. It's great to host you. It's great to host this event. We actually are very happy to bring everyone together and actually partner with Coimbra.Blockchain. And you want me to tell what Whitesmith do very quickly? So yeah, keeping it simple, we help our clients building their products, not just on the technical side, so engineering and design, but also on the product side, on strategy and product management and all that. So yeah, I think keeping it simple is the best way, and so that we actually can jumpstart to what you came to hear. So thank you all for coming. Happy to meet you. If you want, we can talk later. And yeah, enjoy. Thank you.
So as you know, Coimbra.Blockchain, more than events, is a community, and we like to spread knowledge about blockchain, not only technical but also every side of blockchain, for example, economic and also development side. So today we will start with a more technical talk regarding front-end with David, which comes from Finium, and it's better for him to present than me.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thanks for having me. It's really great to be here. And great, it's working. That's a relief. So yeah, today I'll be talking a bit about dApp frontends. So basically, an introduction, not too technical, but also with some technical details about how you can build a front end for a decentralized application. So, a bit about myself first. I am David. I'm a front-end developer at Finium, and over the past few years, we've been building a lot of stuff in the Web3 space. We've had a lot of difficulties faced, but we've also learned a lot above all. So, hopefully, I can share some of what we've learned along the way. Now, you might be thinking, why talk about this? Why talk about front ends for dApps? Well, naturally, as a front-end developer, it's something that interests me. But above all, there is so much going on right now. There's like a crazy rate of innovation, of new things coming up, that I think it's very helpful to have this kind of conversation when we're getting into the Web3 space. Because that's really one of the main problems, I believe, coming into this space, is trying to understand basically what is the overall architecture, you could say, how all the different pieces fit in, how we can make this work. And so to start with, this is a really broad overview, one possibility. So we have the front end on the client somewhere. Somewhere out there is the blockchain. We don't really know where, but it's there. We want to interact with it. We want to get data from it. So that is one connection there is. But it's quite likely that that will need a bit more than that. It might need a backend. It might need an indexing service to query data successfully. It might need storage, something like IPFS. And really, there are plenty other services I could mention. Basically, many specific needs, there are many services that you can use. But this is, we could say, a good starting point. So if we focus in on the front-end part, like how does it actually work on the front end? There are basically three key concepts and that is the signer, the provider, and contracts. So the signer, you can think of the signer basically as the end user. In most cases, that is what happens. So there will need to be some user interaction so that you can have access to the signer. The user needs to basically approve the connection on their wallet. And the signer basically has the ability to sign mostly transactions, but also messages. And this is actually very useful, and we'll come back to this later. So we have the signer, then there is a provider. This is pretty self-explanatory. A provider provides data. It's our connection to the blockchain. You can think of this more as a read connection. And there are several ways of setting this up. We could use services like Infuda or Alchemy, these two, and I believe these are the main options currently. But if you're just starting out, you might not need to worry about this, because if your browser has the MetaMask extension, for instance, then that acts basically as a default provider. So just to get started, you might not need to actually sign up to these services. However, if you do, they're pretty easy to understand. So the final piece on the front end are the contracts, right? Because presumably your dApp needs to interact with stuff on the blockchain. And if there is a contract deployed on the blockchain, the front end needs to have basically a counterpart, an instance of that deployed contract, so that we know what functions it has, what we can do with it. So to create this instance, basically we need the signer and an ABI. So an ABI, you don't need to worry too much about what it is. It's basically a description of everything that the contract can do. This is an example, so we can do transfers, and for that we need to provide an address, another address for 2, and a value. So pretty simple. It's a description of the contract. All right, so now we have these 3 key concepts. How can we actually make things happen? Well, to begin with, I really recommend you check out one of these resources, so Ethers.js or Web3.js. And these are pretty standard general purpose libraries for interacting with Web3 things. So if you check out, this is Ethers. And if you're doing dApps, you will inevitably have to come back to this for reference. And yeah, so let's look at some code. And I'll begin with what is more like a basic, naive approach to this, but it's useful for understanding these concepts. Let's just see if this works. So, well, if you're making a dApp, one of the first steps is to choose like a bold color scheme and a monospace font. They usually work. Now, like I said, by having the MetaMask extension, what that does is it injects a provider into the browser. So I don't know if you can see this very well. Hang on. So if I do window.ethereum, there is a thing there that was basically placed there by the extension, and yeah, that's the read connection to the blockchain, basically. So I can go through this step, request a connection, and then we have, like, in this case, it's just a simple form. This is my address. I don't have internet right now, so it's not going to work very well. That's a slight problem. Basically, it displays my balance, or it would, if there were internet. That is also a requirement, an internet connection, by the way. So we have the balance and the basic form where I put an address, a value, and send. Okay, so simple stuff. So what does this look like? So this is how I'm doing the actual connection part. I'm getting that globally injected Ethereum thing, and I'm creating an instance of a provider with that. This provider class is imported from the ethers package I mentioned. So then, once I have a provider, I can call methods on that. In this case, eth request accounts. So this is like an RPC call that actually makes the prompt open and request for a connection. And there are plenty others. We can add chains, switch chains, but I'll just start with this one because it's the most necessary. So we need to await for the user to accept, and once they do, we get back an address. We can also have access now to the signer. So if you check this, signer.sign message, I can do this kind of stuff with the signer, like I mentioned. So I'm just saving this stuff. This is a React app, by the way, but it's just an example. So I save the provider, signer, etc. And I can also do something like this. So window Ethereum on some event, such as account changed, I would deal with that. This is like an event listener for when the user does things with the wallet. Okay, so this gives us a signer. This provides a connection. And I'm using that here. This is like the root of the app. So if there is a signer, I have the greeting and this component. So this component is the actual form where I have the inputs. And so if you go back here, what is going on here? First of all, there is a contract for this token, which is definitely USDC or something. I don't know. So I need to create an instance of a contract for that. And then I need to get the balance. And then I need to send. So that's basically first instantiate the contract and then interact with it. So how I'm doing that here is pretty simple. I have this function where I say new contract. I have the address of the token, where it's deployed basically, the ABI, which I copy pasted from somewhere, and the signer that I now have access to. So once I have that, I can just do things like contract, transfer, contract, balance of, pretty simple stuff. All these, of course, are async operations. So back in my component, I say get balance, so balance of the address, and now you're thinking maybe that will return a number, because that makes sense, but no, that's not what happens. This returns a big number. A big number is basically a representation of a number. It's complicated. But basically, to transform that into a regular number, we have to use some utility function from ethers. And this is what I said. You'll keep having to refer back to the documentation for this kind of situation. So, OK, that's nice. That gives us a balance. How do we actually send stuff? That happens in this function. So it's pretty similar. Contract transfer, I pass in one parameter, which is where I'm sending it to, and then another value. So this parse units, before it was format units and now it's parse, is basically the opposite. So now I have a regular number and I want to transform it into a big number. So that's what's going on here. So this will execute the operation if the user approves, obviously. And I mean, that's it. That's all we need to happen, essentially. So wait. What is wait? Well, like I said, asynchronous operations. This transaction has a hash, but meanwhile it's being mined on the blockchain. So we can tell it to wait for a certain number of block confirmations, in this case 2. If I didn't define anything here, it would just do 1 confirmation, I believe. OK, so that is like the basic approach. And it works. But you can probably guess that it has a bunch of problems. First off, there's a lot of boilerplate. There are a lot of edge cases that we're probably not considering. And we're actually only supporting one wallet so far, which is MetaMask. And it's very likely that if you have a dApp, you'll need to support a whole bunch of options. So, what can we do to improve the situation? Well, fortunately, there are a whole bunch of options out there that we can use to improve our lives and our dApps. One example is RainbowKit. Another is Web3 Modal. I think this was made specifically by the Wallet Connect team, in fact. And if you're looking for something a bit more complete that will help you deal with transactions, with actual interaction, you can use something like dAppKit or WagMe. Actually, RainbowKit depends on WagMe. It's like an extension that focuses specifically on handling wallets. But WagMe, okay, so a bit of context about WagMe. First of all, it's a terrible name, but it's actually a pretty good library. So I'll just show the documentation. I can't show the documentation. Basically, first off, they're backed by Paradigm. Paradigm are basically a company that backs several interesting Web3 projects. So it's a good kind of assurance that they are backed, so they will probably be around for a while, which is nice to know. Second, WagMe is specifically thought for React. It has pretty good integration with React, although it also has like a core version that you can use vanilla or use it to integrate with other libraries. That's helpful. Nice. So this is their documentation. They have this section for core, which is the vanilla section, basically, which is good. And then they have specifically a React section. They have a bunch of hooks here, which are very useful. And I'll go into a bit of detail about how you can use this to improve my previous example, essentially. Okay, so the dApp looks the same, except now we have a Wallet Connect button with this nice modal. We can connect. I was already connected. And we have the same form. Okay, so similar thing. So how can we actually do this with WagMe? First of all, we have to create a base configuration which will sit basically at the root of your app, and it will wrap the whole thing, providing context for all the hooks you can use. That's what I've got here, config. So I have to pass in this client. And this is essentially how we want our Web3 part to behave. So first of all, we have this configure chains function. And what we're doing is passing in the chains that we want to support. In this case, mainnet and Goerli. A provider. And this, if you have, for instance, Infuder keys or other API keys, this is where you would use them. And here we have polling intervals. So this is super useful. For those of you who don't know, polling is basically a method where you refetch data at a given interval. And that is very useful for keeping the UI up to date. So that is something that WagMe does out of the box. So if you're like displaying someone's balance, it will periodically update. And it does that in a kind of for free way. So we're passing that stuff into this function that creates the client. And then we have this, so connectors. A connector is basically a method of connection in WagMe. So we have injected connector, that is any connector that injects Ethereum into the browser, not the currency, but the provider. For instance, MetaMask is an injected connector, and also Wallet Connect. Okay, so this is like the base settings. How do we do those interactions? So if we check out Connect, here we're using one of those WagMe hooks called useConnect. And what this does, it returns several things, such as connectors. connectors is an array of all those connectors we defined. So I'm looping over them and displaying a button for each one, like with the name. Unclick connect, and that will do the actual process. So you'll notice there are also these properties, like is loading, and I could have is error, is idle, is success. So this is basically the state of the operation, and this is very useful for this kind of async procedure where it goes through several states. What happens is that those states will update in the hook, and we can use that for conditional rendering. So instead of doing like sets loading and then doing the same for error and the same for data, we don't need to do that because it's taken care of by the hook, which is super useful, saves you a lot of time. So this does a connection, which is nice. If we check out the root, we can use this other hook, user count. That gives us an address and is connected. We could also do the same thing here, like is connecting, is disconnected, is reconnecting, all possible states. And then we have that same form here, details. Okay, so this is a little bit trickier, but still easy to use, I believe. So we have a couple of hooks here. We have use balance, which obviously gets a balance. We give it the address whose balance we want to know, which is mine in this case, the address of the token, and format units. So for those of you who are aware, basically these tokens have a decimal setting, and it could be a number or it could accept like ether, gwei, wei, etc. It doesn't really matter if you don't understand this right now. It will make sense later. So in our previous example, this is what gave us that crazy big number which we had to parse in a very weird way. But what happens here is that we get balance, and I'm showing it down here, and it has like balance formatted, balance symbol. How nice. We could also get balance value, which is an actual big number. So the hook takes care of the actual parsing for us, so we don't have to have specific utils for doing that. We just get formatted out of the box, which is very helpful also. So that was the easier hook because it's just a read operation. How about sending, the actual write operation? That's a bit trickier. It involves two hooks. Use prepare contract write, which is a very long name, but it's accurate. And then use contract write. So this is basically an intermediary step which returns us a config that we can use for the part that actually matters. So it's a similar thing. We pass in the address of the contract, an ABI. And by the way, this isn't the ABI I just copy-pasted. This is provided by WAGME, and it's strongly typed, which is helpful. By the way, I don't know the people who are in front end here who deal with JavaScript if you use TypeScript, but I strongly recommend it. And this is one example where it comes in handy. So if I do function name, it's actually strongly typed to only use the functions that exist on this contract and which are write operations, so approve, transfer, and from. And then the arguments, so it's like to and the value. And these are also strongly typed, by the way. So if I do transfer from, it errors out here because it knows that the transfer from function needs 3 arguments and not 2. So just use TypeScript, yeah. Yeah, the arguments, I actually still have to use parse units. There's no getting away from it. You'll also notice this type, which is OX string. This is just weird. It's a string with OX in the beginning. It's not very useful. They decided to use it because it looks cool, I think. But it basically represents an address. So this hook will return a config that I can use in this write hook, and this gives me a function that I can call. I know this looks very kind of many steps to do something, and it's a very React way of doing something because it uses hooks, but it is actually quite effective here. So when I submit the form, it calls the right function, and that actually does the transaction. Again, here we get the state of the transaction, like is loading, is doing something. And we can use that here in the UI, so like is loading, data, we access a hash on the data. So it makes it quite easy to add this data to the UI. Now, I know it looks maybe unnecessary to have this middle step, but there are actually some advantages to doing this way. Because when we do this kind of write operation, some computation is done, such as estimating gas fees, validating the arguments, and by doing this beforehand, we can save some time, make the modal, like the MetaMask modal, open faster, better as gas estimations. So there are some possible advantages to having this slightly more convoluted method. Okay, so I know that was many steps, but I hope you can agree with me that this makes things a lot easier, a lot more practical, and actually more reliable in the long term. So great. We now have a dApp. It's done. Not really. We have a front end that interacts with a contract, which is nice, and it works well. However, in most real-world cases, that's not going to be enough. We're going to need some access to data. Now, I'll give the example of NFTs. So you'll remember there was like that NFT craze some time ago, and it might come again, who knows. But that is actually a good example of the need for indexing. So you may know, not very relevant here, but an NFT contract will have any number of assets on it. And if we wanted to make a gallery with a nice front end where we display all those artworks with the option to buy or mint or whatever, we would have to get all the assets from the contract, right? So we could do something like contract get all the assets, or get all my assets, or something like that. But that doesn't work. It would be nice, but that's not how it works. Which is ironic, actually, because the blockchain is just a load of data, but it's not very accessible. We could get like the asset, a specific asset by ID. That would work. We could get a specific transaction. But when we actually need to build something useful for users with, say, historical data, aggregated data, actually useful data, then the blockchain is not very helpful. And we need something a bit more thought for front ends. So I'll see if this works. In my very good dApp, I have this gallery. It's a heavy request. It might take a while. Let's see, yeah. This is a bunch of NFTs. They're all very good, as you can see. And this is something, the kind of operation that dApps have to do. Get a bunch of data from the blockchain and display it. So how do we actually do that? Well, one solution would be to deal with this on your own backend. Like have a service on your backend that looks at the blockchain, records everything, provides it to the front end. That is one solution. But another option which we've worked with before is using something like the graph. This is an indexer. And let me show the graph. So you can check out their site. I'm not going to go into details about how you can set up the graph, because that would be a whole other talk and it wouldn't be me giving it. But essentially, it's an API for accessing blockchain data in a useful way. So there are some examples here, I believe. Yeah, explore. I don't know. Sushi swap. So it's a basic GraphQL interface here. And you'll see I have things like querying tokens first 5, and I could do like order by ID or something. So you'll see this is kind of a regular, familiar-looking API, and that's what the graph provides, essentially. It's an API for getting state from the blockchain. More specifically, what this does is, like, you create a service that is pointed at a given contract or more than one contract, and it listens to the events emitted by those contracts. It saves them, and it allows you to query them. That's like the very basic explanation of what it does. And that's what we can use on the front end. So I'm using specifically this GraphQL endpoint, and I'm doing this kind of query, like tokens that have a name, first 20, and just display them. And this is great because it keeps up to date. As the blockchain grows, this will also be kept up to date, and it's something that a front end can use. And it's not like bleeding edge, it's just an API, okay? It's something we know. Okay, so actually, speaking of NFTs, that brings us to another problem with dApps, which is storage. So, as you may know, storing things on the blockchain is kind of expensive, and storing images or videos is crazy. So it mostly doesn't happen. Instead, we have solutions such as IPFS, which is sort of the de facto standard for storing things in a distributed way in Web3 right now. Although, if you insist, you can use Arweave, which literally stores images and media on the blockchain. I've never used it, but it's worth checking out. So some of you may be familiar with IPFS. Essentially, it's a peer-to-peer network. What happens is that when you upload content to IPFS, it gets content addressed. So essentially, and a unique ID is calculated based on the content. And as you can see in this very good diagram, a hash is created based on a file, which is called a CID, and then you can use that to refer to the file. And this gives us some assurances. For instance, the same content uploaded at any point in the network will produce the same CID, because it's only the content that matters. Also, you can't have different content with the same CID, because it's unique to that piece of content. So it's not perfect, but it gives us some very important assurances that we can use in like decentralized applications. So how can you use this? Again, there are a bunch of solutions. One of them is NFT storage, like bold color scheme, as I said. This is a project actually created by IPFS. It really facilitates specifically storing for NFTs. They actually have like a very easy to use UI, which you could use if you wanted to manually upload things. Although if you're building a dApp, you probably want to interact with this through an API, which exists, obviously. They have this SDK that you can use, API keys, and that way you can upload stuff in a pretty easy way, and they will give you back the CIDs. So, all this talk of NFTs, it obviously, it's a cliche by now that NFTs are just images and so on. However, storage and IPFS is not only for images, okay? You can actually store entire websites on IPFS, basically any content, it can be stored there. And this is just an example. It's a shameless plug also, because it was developed by our team. So this is an actual NFT, a regular 721 thing. But actually, it's playable. So, obviously not an image. It's actually a whole front end, basically. It's a Tetris game built statically and stored on IPFS, which is then pointed to by the NFT. So it's kind of a far-fetched example, but it actually demonstrates how storage and IPFS and decentralized things, well, there's still a lot to be explored here. It's also a good game. So you'll have noticed by now that I've been talking a lot about regular services with APIs, GraphQL, like API keys, and none of that is particularly like bleeding edge. They already existed before. It seems very familiar, and that is one of the things we faced building dApps, is that a lot of the things that we'll build, they're not anything completely new. We're reusing a lot of Web 2 technology, and that is simply a reality of building dApps. Not everything is on-chain. That simply is not feasible. So I think that's a good moment to mention this, sign in with Ethereum. And this is basically a method that makes the most of a user wallet. So I'm going to try and find an example here. Fileverse. So you may have noticed this kind of thing out in the wild. This is RainbowKit, by the way. So yeah, MetaMask. So I've got this message. Come on. Yeah. Signature request. So it's asking me to sign a message, which says a bunch of stuff. It has my address. It has a timestamp. It has a nonce. Whole bunch of stuff. I sign it. And yeah, I'm logged in, basically. I can disconnect. So what's going on here? It's a basic method of authentication, as you could tell. Basically what happens is the front end makes a request to the back end for a nonce, for security reasons, obviously. And then it presents a message to the user for them to sign that has a nonce, it has a timestamp, a bunch of other stuff. The user has to sign that message and send it back to the back end. The back end now has the address, message, and signature. So it can actually look at those three things and validate that it was actually that address which produced that signature, which means that it's not an impersonator. It's not someone randomly sending a request saying, this is the address that I have. No, it's actually that wallet signed the message, really. So if it passes that validation, great, we can authenticate the session. So it saves authentication cookies or uses JWT, something like that, which will authenticate the user, making them logged in. So really, it's just a method of authentication which doesn't rely on emails and passwords. It uses the fact that the wallet is an address and a password at the same time, which is really cool. And I believe an example of how we can actually integrate Web3 technology and more traditional Web 2 concepts and ideas into the same package, which is really cool. It's obviously not perfect. There are still problems to be solved. Of course there are. But it's overall something we're really excited into looking at, and we see it growing a lot constantly, and we're looking forward to keep sharing that knowledge and building with it. So that will be it. For now, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Thank you. Sure. I don't know if you need a microphone. Or I don't know. I don't know.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I was curious about the number you sent as a parameter to the wait function, the number of blocks you were waiting to be synced up.
Yeah.
Why 2? Is there a standard for it? And a follow-up would be if the WAGMI default was 1 also, because I saw that there was no parameter there.
I don't believe there's a default. Like, in principle, more is better. So the if you don't wait any confirmations, well, it was registered, but it might not get mined. So there's it's a bit of a gray area. However, if you wait for as many transactions as needed, like the UI will be stuck for possibly a long time. So I don't believe there's a standard safe amount. WAGMI, I believe, doesn't have a default. You would have to do that manually also. They provide a way, I believe they provide a way for doing that, yes. But I'm not totally sure. That's a good question.
Thank you.
No more questions?
Right. Thank you. I could just look into the documentation, but I think we have time for the question. Does WAGMI provide an out-of-the-shelf way of computing the gas fee for a contract in this case, for this DApp example, instead of relying just on the MetaMask, for instance?
I believe so. Well, at least they have they have a hook for that. They have a use gas fees hook. I'm not totally sure about how much you can configure it to estimate a certain need. So I'm not totally sure about that, but it has like gas fee estimation.
Nice, nice. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
So thank you, David, for this insight, for actually telling us how to use our most common or most used on our daily basis Web 2 technology integrating with Web 3. Now I would like to ask Mario to come here, talk a little bit about Ethport. I think. There's some available seats here, people. Come on, fill them in. No point on being standing.
Hello, hello. Testing. Okay. Okay. GM, everybody. So I'm here to talk about Ethporto. Ethporto is an event that is going to happen from the 16th to the 18th of March. And I believe that the name tells where the location is going to be. So it's going to be in Porto, which is 1 hour drive from here, so pretty comfortable. And it's going to be at a historic place, so an old market, now a club, so it's Hard Club. And essentially we're going to have 3 main components of the event. We're going to have a hackathon. So the hackathon is going to be an open track hackathon. So you can build anything you'd like as long as you use Ethereum technology. And on top of that, we're going to have bounties from the sponsors. So basically there will be a 10,000 euro prize for the whole hackathon. But on top of that, we'll have, for example, Pith, that is going to have a 1K bounty. We're going to have Chainlink, also with a 1K bounty. So basically, you can apply for all of these bounties if you participate in the hackathon. And we're also going to have workshops. So the workshop part is going to be essentially in terms of onboarding people from Web 2 to Web 3. Either is they're looking to set up Ledger or anything else like that, like real newbie stuff, but also for developers. So we're going to have someone from Ethereum Foundation giving a Solidity course and a lot of interesting developer-related stuff on the workshops. Regarding the conference, so the conference is going to be a little bit different from what happens in the industry. So typically you have more tech or more infrastructure related stuff or DeFi stuff. We're actually going to try to focus on real world use cases like supply chain and how supply chain can be leveraged using blockchain technology. public goods, decentralized science, governance. So we're going to have someone from MakerDAO also talking about that. And of course, as you can see, there will be networking as well, but most importantly, and of course I saved this for the last, food and wine. So we're also going to have some side events. Some of them might be going to a wine cellar and trying out port wine, which is going to be cool. And of course, some parties and some side events. We're actually going to have a side event promoted by Finium, related with StartNet technology. That's going to be fun. And we're also going to have a mobile workshop that is going to be provided by Pink Room. And many more will come. So some of them more related with parties and fun, and some of them also related with fun, but more on the tech side. Let's put it that way. That's it. So basically, what are we looking for? So in terms of sponsors, I believe we're good. So it's good because we need money to make this happen. This is a community-led event and a non-profit entity, and we want to make sure that this stays on the right path so that we can make more additions in the future. But what we do need is people that participate in the hackathon. So if you want to have a cool opportunity to participate in this event, being a hacker could be interesting. And if you don't want to participate in the hackathon, but you still want to attend the event, you can either buy a ticket or you can become a volunteer. So volunteer applications are also open, and that's a way for you to save some euros if you want to be a part of it. That's it on my side. I know that you're eager to listen to Alex, so I'll leave it. I'll leave it here, and I hope to see you all in Porto. Thank you very much. Sorry, forgot to ask. Any questions? If not, I'll be around during drinks and food, so please feel free to approach me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mario, for the introduction. So right now, as you may know, we're going to have a little talk with Alexandre Mendes. Welcome. A round of applause, please. So as you may have seen, now we are going to talk a little bit about startup funding in Web3. So maybe we can start by introducing yourself, Alexandre, and talking a little bit about your experience in Web3 or investing.
Okay. Hello.
Puxa só para frente.
Are you listening? Yeah.
Tiago.
No? Yeah. Here I am. Too loud, yeah. First thing would be I'm very happy to be finally in Coimbra. Being in Coimbra is quite meaningful for us. We've been putting quite some effort in boosting the community here, so it's pretty good to see you around. So count me in to help boost this. How have I started in the Web3 space? Well, I have a long past in working with startups and building ecosystems, mostly trying to foster the intersection between stakeholders in the ecosystems, usually founders with investors, founders with people or talent that they will need to hire. When I started having, well, say a more serious job that I could tell my mom and make it shareable somehow, it was when I was serving as the director of Startup Braga, a public incubator based in Braga. And this is a coincidence between the emergence of the first startups in the Web3 space. One of the leading at the time was Utrust, that brought a huge frenzy to the ecosystem over there, and also nationally. And there was this feeling around ICOs and the huge frenzy about crypto. So I started paying some attention to that. But on the other hand, I was mostly also trying to help the ecosystem, the entrepreneurial ecosystem, thrive as a whole.
Okay, awesome. So the first question that I would like to ask you is there any difference in Web3 companies? Are they structured in any different way? What's the standpoint?
I think that is that could be the singular topic of our discussion today, and it would be also actually nice to have to transform this into a conversation rather than
exactly. Yeah.
Well, a kind of a talk or just my point of view, because I think that this is a critical moment that we are living in, and I have a honest doubt about this topic of around Web3, which is how will we're experiencing now a transitional moment in the Web3 space. My point is, will the founders that arrived to the Web3 space early, say 2016 or even earlier, still be able to keep up to this transition that we are experiencing in 2023? I'm not sure. And I'm quite curious about it. What this means is that historically, the Web3 space has behaved in a very alternative and even challenging way, and introducing new ways of funding and bringing new ideas to the ecosystem too, that were both challenging, somehow libertarian in some sense, but also super bold and interesting. And what we are now experiencing is a convergence between the behavior of the Web3 industry to the regular startup ecosystem. And some of the people in the Web3 space argue that this is not a good thing, that this is somehow even disappointing, and other people, other stakeholders in the ecosystem argue that this is the thing to be done. So this is actually a good discussion that we should all think about and even contribute to.
Yes, exactly. So more than an interview or a discussion, if you have any questions or have anything that you want to say, we are open for participation. So go ahead. Maybe give them the mic.
This was successful.
Yeah, it was fast. Good.
Hey. So usually when there's funding for a startup, it's for some of their equity.
Yeah.
Is funding for Web3 companies some of their tokens?
Is funding for Web3 companies tokens?
For their tokens?
Quite commonly, yes. Yes. So there's again, think of a metaphor. In the Web2 world or the conventional world, we would have equity shares. In the Web3 space, we started introducing this idea of a token. And the token and this idea of shares became really proximal and sometimes convergent, intertwined, other times confusing. So we are still building up the space, and hence the need of every single stakeholder think through this process.
And as a follow-up, is there any talks with the legal in terms of the entities that regulate the shares, regulating companies, tokens that are used for equity?
I think quite interestingly, the legal side of things has put some effort in keeping up. So it's not that they are lagging innovation behind. I can say that because once they spot an agreement and see that all the parties involved are okay with it, they can somehow translate that Web3 agreement into Web2 terms, you see? So they can put that in paper. If this is the right approach, the analogy to the Web2 world or not is something that we can argue, and perhaps we can push the boundary to something better. But I don't feel that the legal side of this question is lagging us behind, to be honest. I think that we still are struggling with some organizational innovations like DAOs. And if you invest in a DAO, whatever this means, what governance do you really have there? What's your influence there? How do you manage this idea of a cap table? You see, again, we are still conflicting this idea of bringing Web 2 concepts to the Web 3 space, and sometimes this is productive, other times it isn't. So I think that in a more common pattern, I see that tokens, investing in tokens of a company being built, it's not an issue at all. Some investors actually prefer to invest in tokens. Others tend to invest in tokens and equity. But usually, in my experience, that conversation is brought and led by the founders. So far, what I've been seeing is the investors trying to keep up to the founders' expectations too, in that sense. In what comes to the governance and what happens if something goes poorly, we're still figuring out in some sense. But on the others, I think we usually have an overall picture that frames the context there and also the approach to managing.
So does this mean that Web3 based investment means that those companies are no longer private and getting an IPO? They're already public, because if the token is on a DEX, they start off as public.
Again, if we work side by side with this idea of an analogy, if you publish or release an ICO and you have a community of holders of that ICO, perhaps you are more closely to a public company rather than a private company, because you have a lot of eyes on it and a lot of people, sadly, on a Discord channel or on a Telegram, trying to ask questions about your results and pushing you on different directions. Rather, a public company that has a more structured agenda, management tools, and also expectations from the shareholders that brings perhaps a calm to the management and strategic positioning that is different when comparing to the Web3 space. Again, historically, people were paying a lot of attention months ago to the ups and downs of a token, and they were doing it on a daily basis and sometimes hourly basis. So tension was quite present there, and the sensitivity to the minimum ups and downs was quite high. This brought a huge challenge to management teams in Web3 companies. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this question and all the questions. So answering to this, you actually went to a question that I was going to actually make you. So I can do it now. It's already partially answered, I guess. And it is, how do you think Web3 fundraising models compare to traditional ones? So basically IPO versus ICO.
Well, we had the golden age for ICOs and 5 years ago. You had ICOs by default. Then obviously a lot of scams started to somehow pollute the reputation of that approach, and consequently also on the ecosystem. Those spillover effects around the scams or the scammy approaches that some people were doing brought a cognitive effect that was polluting some part of it that was really positive. So I'm not sure if the idea and concept and approach of an ICO is dead. I wouldn't argue that. I think it's too early and perhaps negative if we throw that approach away right now. We need to acknowledge that so many people in the ecosystem, in the industry, were severely harmed by investing in those ICOs. So IPO and ICO, for me, it's actually kind of hard to compare, because on a Web 2 company, you tend to think about IPOs as an exit solution. And when we were doing ICOs years ago, we were doing it to kickstart the operations. So you were betting honestly on a white paper, at times on a technology or a team, but the white space there was immense. And the IPO is more of an end, and the ICO it isn't. But my point here is, regardless of what is happening nowadays at the Web3 space, it's not the right time to jump to conclusions. I think that most likely we have in the room the next founder of the next big thing, and we still don't know. And that is the opportunity here. I'm pretty sure that we will have a severe here in the Web3 space. A lot of projects won't survive, probably. That's part of the game. That's part of the hype cycles. It comes in books. This doesn't mean that the principles, the ideology behind it, doesn't have value. And this is something that we need to put in our walls so that we don't forget. And that is also the why of these events, and the why of keeping up with the technology and the readiness and the business models, which suddenly became a part of this conversation here. Years ago, we were not discussing topics like product market fit in Web3 companies. In 2023, it's the new hot topic. How do you find product market fit? How do you get there?
Okay, awesome. So the next question I have is, what are the key criteria when evaluating what's a compelling offer for a potential Web3 investment?
Okay. So it really depends a lot, but I would say if it has a token behind it, the tokenomics model is something that necessarily people have to put some attention to. You should, and it's really hard to do it properly if you copy paste it from the internet. So you should ask for help from an expert in doing it. It's an economic model that, it demands some thinking about it. But definitely that is something that people look at. The whole model, from the liquidity to the way how you will add value to the token, is something that you should think from coast to coast. Nowadays, also the team that is trying to build, and assessing that the team has the skills, the capacities, and the drive to actually build what they are promising, is something that's very critical. Also, since we are living this stage in the industry, I think that the expectations grew higher. So we are looking more into filling the gaps that we already know that the industry missed 6 months ago or a year ago. So we have now more accumulated knowledge of what is not working. So I tend to feel that nowadays the investment industry is trying to narrow the scope of the strategic investments that they are doing, trying to target more infrastructural technologies or products, so that actually this whole idea of the blockchain and building for the blockchain and then onboarding customers will work. So we still have work to be done there. And on the other hand, I think that we are now exploring some more mature projects, say in DeFi. So the business area or the industry topic that the founding team is exploring is also obviously something that every investor look up to.
Okay, so regarding what you said about companies straightening their strategy and making less investments, what do you think are the biggest challenges in that Web3 startups are facing right now and in the near future?
Well, forgive me for raising this expectations too high, but I think it's a commitment that we all need to do. I think that we are all facing a credibility challenge. So we need to grow up and be up to the standard. It's simple. So let's build things. I think the opportunity is huge. The technology and the industry promise makes total sense, specifically when we start seeing the rise of AI applications and so many discussions about how our data belongs to us, for instance. And well, the ownership topic is a huge thing. So I think that keeping up to the expectations is an underlying condition for all of us exploring the topic here. The other side would be actually investors are perhaps nowadays slightly more reluctant in just throwing money to things and see what happens. But this is a positive thing, because otherwise it was what's really happening is, you know, the feeling of let's stop this madness of throwing money to things and see if something happens. What investors are doing is trying to be more intentional about where they put more money. So it's still early to say that they are not leveraging as much money as they were doing in 2022, for instance, because we are still kickstarting the year. They are having more criteria in how to do it. And if you would ask me the criteria, I think we are still trying to figure out. Some of them are we can already spot. Others, it's still early to say, and most likely they will evolve. But again, people, for market circumstances, for everything that happened so far in crypto and the consequences of that, namely regulation and compliance, have put investors looking in a different way. But again, I can't assume, we shouldn't assume that the market is slowing down. It's evolving and expecting slightly more maturity around the projects and the teams and the execution capacity.
Okay. So regarding the credibility point that you just said, and also the previous answer on teams and the fact that most people probably agree that teams on every project are an essential point. How do you actually access the team behind Web3 and make sure they have credibility?
Okay. Credibility in that sense, it has to do with technological expertise, and then that you can assess by simply reviewing what's done and having an expert reviewing what's done. And again, it's not that complicated to do and run that due diligence in what comes to the product, to the processes, to the execution capacity, and to the team itself. You just have to start that conversation and to make sure that you have that intention to make it happen. I think that is quite positive. Us, for instance, at Visual, we usually are a team to whom founders look at to help found their projects, because we have that technical expertise and seniority, because we've been building in the space for a while now. So we've done it. We know what it's looked like. We know what it's like to launch on the mainnet a new project. So that is something that it's quite common to be rare, in the sense that you have a lot of people joining the Web3 industry because of the frenzy and the good paychecks in the end of the month, but you still need to bet on the capacity to actually build the product and the business if you are already at the stage where you are ready to start selling. So assessing that credibility is something that the founder also should expect from the investor. An investor that only throws money to you, well, it's nice, but I'm not sure if the work will be exactly what you would expect. So expect due diligence from both parties, because that means discipline, and that means that you're working with someone that is also professional enough to raise the bar for your project. And that increases the odds of success. And in this specific industry, something that people pay a lot of attention to is actually reputation. And that reputation happens quite a lot by attending these events and ETH Porto and being a good hacker and start by showing up and participating in a community. Community is a living organism and perhaps the engine of growth of Web3. So when Mario was pitching ETH Porto, I would like to stress the amazing opportunity for us to have this global event happening just nearby. So it's about being part of this very organic community and having a role there. And that will start building your name, and building your name and reputation is like a passport that will easily make and open doors for you and, for instance, make investment opportunities or reaching some big names in the investment industry more easy.
Okay, awesome. So basically concluding this point, changing a little bit the topic, community is essential, showing up is essential, and if you have any questions or relevant things to say, make sure you do it. So changing a little
Irrelevant is also okay.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sure, go ahead. Wait a little bit, just for the mic.
Hello. Yes. Just to give some context, I work for a company that sells a database, and these days in the database industry, we're seeing that open source databases are getting much traction, mostly because databases are used for developers, and developers have more trust. Do you, at any point, give any extra points to Web3 projects that you see that are open source versus ones that are proprietary sources? Like, does that even count for your analysis of a project?
Yes, it counts. I would like to mention something that is an important avenue of collaboration for the industry, which usually we call grants. And this sometimes has different meanings from company to company. But it's quite common for the industry to publish some calls for grants or bounties, it depends, where you support and nudge financially open source projects or projects that don't have the business model that I was, or the product market fit that I was alluding to. And this can go from open source to, say, more research or exploratory projects. So it's a very common avenue that you can explore, for instance. Take us one.
Alex,
Yeah.
I was wondering, what's your feeling around all this pressure that the government in the CEC in the US is putting on crypto world? And could this be an opportunity eventually for European or North American companies?
Great topic. I wish we could all talk about that because I love to listen about your views about that. But just to frame for all of those that are not that acquainted to the topic, so the US government is putting a lot of pressure into Web3 companies due to recent scandals in the industry. and they are putting this pressure with regulation. And this regulation creates a clear opportunity to Europe. And knowing Europe, I don't think we will benefit from that because we don't usually have the agility to do it. Quite often in this space and across several innovation topics actually, I tend to think that if politicians don't know what to do, they should play dead, and that's fine. My greatest concern is that regulation in the US creates a common ground that somehow will influence some stakeholder in Europe, and as a consequence we can also start having such a regulation in Europe. On the other hand, I'm quite curious about the regulatory approach in the US because it seems kind of weird what they are doing. And on the other hand, again, it's a huge debate if we need regulation in the crypto space and the Web3 space. And just to be clear, blockchain is way bigger than crypto, and the monkey pictures are just a fragment of what NFTs can be applied to. And this is what concerns me when we talk about regulation in this space. We need, and perhaps it's positive, I think perhaps it's positive to have more regulatory brackets, but we can't, it's too soon to narrow the innovation potential. So my point about that is I'm not sure about the honest agenda of the US government behind it, and though some voices tell that these regulations are also having the intention to regulate the inflation spiral that we were having and somehow constraining the revenue streams that investors could have, and try to put a dent in this emerging industry that was too digital for these very analog institutions. Well, I'm not sure if this is true, but it's an important sign that we as founders and stakeholders and the ecosystem should pay attention. And again, we have an important voice in helping these people decide. So if we commit to the expectations and we comply to, well, be somehow honest, but keeping the drive of innovation and building stuff that really are meaningful, I don't see why they should regulate to punish us in Europe.
So the next question was actually about regulation.
Oh, yeah.
And what did you think about the regulatory landscape for Web3 companies? How it would evolve in the next years? But since we already don't have much time, I may skip to the last question, which is, how do you see Web3 space evolving in the next years? And finishing off, what advices would you give to aspiring Web3 entrepreneurs?
How do I see? I think again, Web3 founders are expert surfers. We are pretty good with forming waves and surfing the waves and taking benefit out of the waves. So this is what I expect from founders in this space. Let's understand the technology. Let's acknowledge the past, but put our minds, make sure that we dedicate our best resources to think about the technological potential and the technological importance in the world that we are living on, specifically digitally. And the blockchain has a huge service to pay to the humanity in that sense. So what I expect from founders is drive, passion, and new ideas. And let's see how it evolves. I'm sure it will evolve, and this is an important statement because people are fearing death and desert and the end of the Web3 or the blockchain or the crypto projects. I don't think that will happen at all, even though it is likely that we see a lot of projects with the super short runways actually pausing. And that's fine. It's part of the innovation. Again, it comes in books. That happened with AI that is now at its peak, and that happened with 3D printing, for instance, or the self-driving car, you name it, or in biotech, for instance, or digital health that is now super hot, and for years it was on a slow burn. So probably we are now at the stage of a slow burn of the best projects that there will be in the Web3 space. So what I hope is to find people that frame the idea, frame the opportunity, and understand the technology, regardless of being able to actually build it or not. Then there's plenty of teams like Subvisual or any other team that can actually build it. And this is something that we should nurture and nudge when you are still at school. Because it's the opportunity for you to frame a new technological wave and learn how to surf it. And this is part of your life. You're very young, you'll surf several technological waves across your life. The follow-up question was?
Some advices for
advices.
upcoming entrepreneurs.
My most significant advice is make sure that you align your digital strategies with your analog strategies, in the sense that life is still somehow analog. Coming to events is, again, very important. I'm old enough to have seen unicorns being born out of the intersections that we build at these meetups, and it's a great place to meet people and to find a new job and the next big thing. Again, ask yourselves these questions. How do you know that in this room right now it's not the next big founder of something? And this is amazing. Perhaps she's going to be the next big founder, or she, or he, back there. We don't know. So this is something that it should be challenging for us, in the sense that it brings some restlessness to the environment. But on the other hand, we need to focus on the possibilities rather than the bad news, the bad players, the negative players. And we should acknowledge that they also exist. But there's a whole world to be built. And again, for me, crypto is, again, only a small stake of what the blockchain and this idea of distributed systems means. And there's a place for this in the world and in the future, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Finishing up, I would just like to ask for a round of applause for Sandro. Thank you. So thank you everyone for the relevant questions and questions that you asked. This is the end. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you all again. Thank all the sponsors again. Thank the host. Thank IPN and Whitesmith for our latest sponsor. And that's basically it, guys. Thank you so much. Shoot.